it sort of drives me a little bit crazy that the particular kind of high-profile failings of Metro newspapers on the business side then just that brush gets used to like paint the entire rest of the industry. And, we have profitable papers in our portfolio, and we come across profitable papers every day, also unprofitable papers. So, this idea that the business model is forever and always broken, I think is just reflects a real lack of curiosity and I would say empirics on the part of its adherents.
Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Merrigan-Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. And in each episode, I sit down with guests from newsrooms and others in the local news ecosystem to highlight the innovative work of local newsrooms and those that support them, as well as the crucial questions they face. This episode is one I was looking forward to recording for a while, and I was only disappointed that we couldn't go for another hour. I hope you feel the same. I talked with Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro, CEO and co-founder of the National Trust for Local News. Elizabeth's academic background brings a unique and valuable perspective to her work. Prior to the National Trust, she was a senior research fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism. Before that, she led news sustainability research at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and was the research director for the Membership Puzzle Project's Guide to Membership. Dr. Hansen Shapiro teaches strategy and marketing organizational change as an adjunct lecturer in the CUNY Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism's Executive Education Program in News Innovation and Leadership. Say that 3 times fast. From 2016 to 2017, she was a fellow at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University and a center affiliate from 2017 to 2019. She received her PhD in organizational behavior from Harvard Business School. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, never miss an episode by signing up for our newsletter at lnmpod.com. And now I bring you Elizabeth Hansen Shapiro. All right. Well, welcome, Elizabeth. Great to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
All right. Well, let's just jump right into what is the National Trust for Local News? What's its mission and why did you found it?
The National Trust for Local News, we are a national nonprofit organization working to conserve and transform and sustain community news organizations. So our kind of ultimate mission is to build stronger communities by keeping small traditional sources of local news in local hands. And we do that by really a kind of nature conservancy model of national expertise and national knowledge combining with local knowledge and local commitment so that we can ensure long-term and sustainable community news.
Well, let me ask you the question I know you've received, and I've even gotten it from a national funder who was, poking around and knowing my background in entrepreneurship, but also working for one of the chains and now working with newsrooms across Colorado. And that question is simply, why is legacy news worth preserving?
Yeah, it's also a question that we get all the time. And, I think in some ways it's a hard question to answer in the abstract, because what we find in our work in so many places is that what legacy media means and to whom is very much a question of where you live. So, if you live in Omaha, Nebraska, for example, you could say, well, our local paper has been on the decline for the last 20 years. But if you live in, Peach County, Georgia, your local paper has been a longstanding institution. It's probably something that you buy every week and you can't imagine life without it. So I think this kind of it's almost like it's a straw man question of why is legacy media worth preserving. You really have to ask where and for whom.
Absolutely. And so let's dig into that a little bit. So, sometimes the people that are asking that question seriously are coming from a couple different places. One is from sort of an ethical and editorial standpoint of there are a lot of failures that legacy media has, perpetrated over the years. We've neglected certain communities, we've sensationalized, we've clickbaited, we've neglected lots of pieces. And then on the other side are people who are more of a libertarian or free market streak who just say, look, we didn't say buggy whip manufacturers. Why should we save a failing business model? And I have responses to both of those, but I'm curious as to how you respond to each of those angles of attack.
Yeah, I would say on the kind of practice of journalism front, it's absolutely true that the traditional professionalized journalism class, mostly represented by newspapers, has not done right by all parts of their community. And it's been an incredibly editorially driven enterprise as opposed to a community driven enterprise. But I think that kind of risks throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because I think you and I, Tim, have also seen that when those journalists get fired from their newspapers or leave their newspapers and go start their startups, lo and behold, they replicate those exact same practices, because it's really about a way of thinking and a way of understanding what journalism is and who journalism serves. That was made worse, I think, in some aspects of the newspaper model, in part because it was so successful for so long. But just because you're transplanting it into a new business model doesn't mean that you've eradicated the problem. So I think it's a widespread problem that all of us in all kinds of different business models and all kinds of different media have to address. And, and there's been incredible, I think, growth and innovation in folks in the field learning how to be more in connection and in responsive to communities and how to do journalism from that space. Part of what I get really excited about at the National Trust is being able to bring those practices into places that have never been in conversation with those communities. So that's a really exciting innovation that I think we get to do at the Trust that has nothing to do with, the business model or the format per se. And then, on the business model side, I would say, it sort of drives me a little bit crazy that the particular kind of high profile failings of Metro newspapers on the business side then just that brush gets used to paint the entire rest of the industry. And, we have profitable papers in our portfolio, and we come across profitable papers every day, also unprofitable papers. So, this idea that the business model is forever and always broken, I think just reflects a real lack of curiosity and I would say empirics on the part of its adherents.
Absolutely. And the thing that started breaking the business model anyway was Craigslist and then Google and Facebook, and it's all revenue side. It's not a reflection of the demand or the readership. That in many ways that's higher than it's ever been. So I think that's one important point that those critics need to consider. The other thing that you alluded to there is just the diversity of what these newspapers and other news organizations do and their health. I was actually talking with Linda Shapley, who's publisher of Colorado Community Media, which was your first investment, and she and I both were sort of sharing what's the right word for it? Just sort of the growing respect we have for what community newspapers do. And that when we were both, living in large cities, of course, we're still in large cities, but working for Metro dailies or, even as a consumer, there was sort of this dismissive attitude towards weeklies and community newspapers, that the real news was in those, big papers. And, there used to be sort of this ladder that a reporter would climb from one market to another. And what surprised me as I've come to Colorado and began working with all of these different newsrooms is how strong some of these community newspapers are. They are still financially supported by their community, and I think even their print product has, a lifeline still, much longer than some of the Metro dailies probably on the print side. And they are beloved by their communities, and they do important work that we sometimes just dismiss. And I'm wondering if you see that and if you've gone on a similar journey in terms of your understanding of their role in the ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because I was not trained as a journalist and didn't come through that system, I didn't come to this work with, sort of hierarchy in my mind of Metro news above all, but it's definitely been something that I've learned about and experienced firsthand, both from, kind of journalists and colleagues in the industry, but also from funders. I think there's been in the journalism industry funderland, and I think we're starting to see a shift in this, but I would say plenty of funders also share that orientation of the Metro news is the sort of highest level of news and everything else is, service journalism or amateur hour, basically. And, in fact, I think our experience is exactly what you have said. And I think Linda and her journalists are a great example of this. There is an incredible amount of audience loyalty to community news, and I think there's a real art and a real critical importance for all of those reporters who, are literally like driving around every day in order to collect the news in their communities. So I see it as actually the sort of like highest form of local news, because I think it actually reflects what truly local means and the way that I think everyday people experience what local means, which is not local as in like, oh, I, live in a big metro, but local as in like, I live in this neighborhood or I live in this town. And so I think that there's a much better reflection in community journalism of how people experience local in their daily lives, as opposed to the kind of metro, much more distant sets of issues and stories.
Absolutely. And, and it's the full spectrum. So I think they do a better job of capturing that spectrum. But even on the investigative side, I mean, the reporting Colorado community media has done around housing has been phenomenal. The editorial the Golden Transcript did looking back at its treatment of minorities in the paper over the years was something you don't expect out of a community newspaper if you come to it with that sort of prejudice.
Yes, absolutely. And yeah, that's why it's been so fun to, work with Linda and just see all of the ways in which she's been able to, really up the game of the storytelling and the reporting, the community reporting for all of those papers. And, the potential exists there across the country in other parts of our portfolio. Like, there are community newsrooms who want to be doing that kind of work, and they need the leadership and they need the resources and they need the encouragement. But those stories are absolutely there to be told, and there are people who want to tell it. And that's, I think that's the beauty of working in community news.
So let's dig into a little bit about sort of following on that conversation. What do you look for as you're evaluating properties and deciding whether the National Trust can invest in it or bring other funders maybe to the table? When, what are the positive signs, but also what are the negatives when maybe this is not a legacy outlet that is worth saving or that maybe is able, you're not going to get the return that you would need to see?
So, we spent the first 2 years of our existence talking to a lot of publishers across the country and have seen sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And where we have landed on that question is really to create a strategy that's about a state-based approach first, because every state inevitably has stronger titles and weaker titles. And so our goal is to create sustainability across a network so that we can serve larger communities and smaller communities. So the challenge of saying like, is this particular title a good investment, is that on the face of it, it absolutely may not be. And that could be because its community is shrinking. There's been like a base closure, or there's been some, it's hard hit by COVID and it's losing population. So we don't want to make determinations solely on the basis of like, do your financials look okay right now? We want to have a kind of state-based strategy where the ingredients for success at the state level are there so that we can say, is this title serving this community truly an important public and civic service that wouldn't be replaceable by something else? And if that is the case, and then we can have a kind of sustainable network to attach it onto, then that kind of calculation is much different than, okay, you've been losing $100,000 a year for the last 3 years. Do we really want to buy you? Yes or no?
And so when you go in, you've got a metric, a rubric, basically, that you're coming in and you're looking at the community, the paper, all of its financials, right? You're doing a really deep dive to examine where it's at and where it could go.
Yeah, that's right. And we're doing that in the context of a state-based analysis of what's the landscape of papers in this state. Where are there strong papers that are up for sale or could be up for sale? Where are there weaker papers that are at risk of leaving news deserts behind? And then there's a whole other set of calculations for us, which is what's the kind of partnership and funder network? So some states, like North Carolina, for example, which the Democracy Fund has invested in its ecosystem strategy quite heavily. And like those folks have amazing ecosystem fundamentals. Colorado has amazing ecosystem fundamentals. So, on the other side of the ledger, we also want to be sure that there's local partners and local funders and a conversation about the importance of local journalism that we can plug into, because that's really the other side of kind of long-term success.
So let's talk a little bit about what you've done so far. So Colorado is your first investment, but you've been looking nationally and you've made a couple others. So can you talk a little about those projects and how they're going?
So the biggest one for us this summer, as you know, is that On August 1st, we closed on our biggest ever transaction of 22 newspapers, 17 weeklies, and 5 dailies across the state of Maine. So this is definitely our biggest geographic and revenue footprint. And, this is the sort of joy and excitement of startups. We've had a very disciplined and focused strategic plan guiding our work for the last 9 months, and then all of a sudden there's an opportunity that drops into your lap that you kind of can't say no to. So that's, so we've grown significantly opportunistically, but then on the kind of strategic long range part of our growth plan, at the end of last year, we helped KERA diligence and set them up to acquire the Denton Record Chronicle in Dallas. And actually, they just closed on that acquisition also at the beginning of August. And the interesting thing about that project, just from like a startup organizational perspective, we really saw and still do see a lot of potential in public media in the community news space. And that was a project that we learned a lot about the kind of microeconomics of transformation of community papers, and also kind of the dynamics of helping public stations understand the value of community news. But coming out the other side of that, we said, you know what, this is an incredible model that others should take forward, but it's not a scalable model for us. And so that was a really important strategic evolution in my thinking, to go from, okay, we're going to just figure out as many different models as we can, to saying, actually, where we have the most value to provide is in not just the conservation work that we do, but in the actual running of the papers that we can do. So we want to look not just like the Nature Conservancy, but also like Gannett. And so that, that strategic pivot then coming into this year is what allowed us to take a look at the Maine acquisition and go, oh yeah, this is actually a really important accelerant to what we think our value and theory of change is. And no, it's not on the strategic plan, but it is, it's on the path to scale. So those have been 2 really exciting projects to work on.
Talk just for a minute about that evolution. I think when we first started talking about Colorado, your original thought was that you would acquire papers and then turn them back over to the community. What you're thinking, and is that still part of the mix, or?
Yeah, that's such an astute and important question. And, to be honest, like our Maine acquisition really put that question even more front and center for us. And it's something that we had been already thinking about in Colorado. And, I think what our experience in Colorado, and you've had a front seat to this, is that not surprisingly, like these are difficult businesses to run, and they really do require like a very hands-on approach, not necessarily in the day-to-day running, but there's just a whole host of important higher level strategic and fundraising considerations that are difficult to do at an arm's length. Like they really need to have a much more close-in operational context. So that experience in Colorado, and then, taking a look at the Maine acquisition and realizing that there's so much important transformation work that had to be done that really needs to be led and managed and resourced. It was a reaffirmation for me that this Gannett model is really important for long-term sustainability. Now, the other important ingredient, and this is, of course, all missions have parts of their mission that are intention, right? So for us, it's local ownership and sustainability. Local ownership, apart from any national entity that has access to national resources and national scale and national expertise, would really struggle. And in fact, lots of metro papers that are kind of on their own bottoms are experiencing this. So for me, this summer, like Maine was a really important learning experience where me and my team, in conversation with our local funders, were able to say, you know what, local ownership shouldn't be an input to our model. It should be a success outcome, because we want all of these papers to get to a place, and it could be in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. We want them to get to a place where that local ownership is much closer in. And so, in Maine, the evolution of our thinking is around robust local control as an outcome of a successful transformation and board building process, as opposed to like an input starting line. And so what that allows us to do is sort of invite in all of the folks that really want to be engaged and that we want to be engaged in the transformation and kind of institution building process, but not sort of handing over local control and then saying, bye, see you later, like good luck with your papers. And so that's a really important evolution for us in our model, because it's, as I said, like kind of threading the needle between we're a national organization that can bring national expertise and national resources, and understanding that these are deeply local institutions and that their value and their long-term success depends on that, the quality of local participation and local engagement. So, I think we are in addition to being a startup, we are like an innovation in the field. So, I tell my team all the time, like, it's not like we have this figured out. We are like learning and making better and better and better decisions all along the way. And I think this will be something that we continue to learn about and continue to figure out how to do better and better.
Yeah, and there seems to be some maybe convergence of thinking along those lines. I mean, when my first presentation to my board, when I got here talking about our evolution, was that I thought we needed to act and think more like a white hat chain, that you absolutely need local reporters, local editors, local publishers, local salespeople. But is there really a reason for some of these small papers to have, a full-time accountant, or struggle to find a good part-time accountant and do all the chasing of bills, or even having, maybe a reader revenue expert setting up all of your automations and things like that, that there are services that make sense at scale and you could bring in expertise that a small publication can't. And I understand from, one of the national funders that as they're thinking about this Press Forward initiative, that's been part of the conversation, that shared services is really something that the industry needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have both the advantage and the challenge of rolling up operations that each have their own baseline conditions on accounting teams and tech stacks and, media kits and workflows. And so, unlike our friends over in the digital startup department, like, we are also figuring out how to kind of retrofit, but also deconstruct and reconstruct so that all of those costs can be shared at the right level.
So you've talked a lot about sort of your evolution of thinking. Have there been any other things that you would highlight as lessons learned or maybe major surprises?
I'd say on the fundraising side, we're continuing to learn about the dynamics of national versus local fundraising. And, I think a lot of productive work has been done to kind of seed the field in so many places on the importance of local journalism. And so we hear that reflected back to us in a lot of our local conversations, which is wonderful. Of course, the challenge always is that sometimes, on the fundraising side, folks like care about what's in their backyard, but they don't necessarily care about what's beyond that. And so figuring out how to assemble the right coalition of partners and parties so that you can really cover a state or a geography, like that can be a little bit of a challenge, and definitely, in the coalition building category. And one of the things I'm really excited about for Press Forward is for an advancement of that conversation, because I think, local funders also want to know that they're part of something bigger and that there are others who are kind of taking the leap with them. And I think that's going to be a really positive step forward for the philanthropic field in that way.
A lot of the newsrooms you are working with now are for-profit newsrooms, or were formerly for-profit newsrooms. Some of them probably will look at a nonprofit conversion. I think in Colorado, it's a B Corp that is the owner of Colorado Community Media, right? But so as you think about all of these different newsrooms and how you'll make decisions maybe differently than others, how does your mission focus lead you to maybe make different decisions than a pure profit maximizer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And interestingly, I think we actually have to answer the question from the opposite direction when we make these acquisitions, because we are coming in as the nonprofit owner, and we have to be careful that we're not setting expectations that now that you are owned by a nonprofit, it means that you don't have to run revenues over costs anymore. And so we've done a lot of work, frankly, in Colorado, but also in Maine, in coming in to really communicate that we are we are mission-driven nonprofit owners, but our standards for sustainability are really high, and that we expect of ourselves and our news organizations a level of discipline around the business management that feeds the commitment to the mission. So yes, we have longer time horizons. Yes, what's at the top of our hierarchy is impact, not profit. But I deeply believe, and we deeply believe, that the path to impact has to be through a disciplined management of the business, because otherwise, without money, you have no mission. And that's a new twist on quote unquote nonprofit news. And it's different than what a lot of the papers that we acquire have been hearing about nonprofit news. So that's really the way that we tell the story. It's less about, no, we're not about profit, we're about mission, and more about, here's how these two things go hand in hand.
I was just talking with Sarah Beth Berman at AJP this week and said something that I'm not the first to say it. I think I've heard you say it, heard Sue Cross say it, and we probably got it from some other places. But nonprofit is not a business model. It's a tax status. And so you still, regardless of your tax status, you need business discipline, you need revenue to exceed your expenses, you have to invest in the future. All of that is important and sometimes overlooked. But on the flip side, there are decisions that you will make that maybe you wouldn't make if you were running Gannett. I don't want to throw Gannett under the bus, but there are probably, in terms of how you approach audience, how you approach reporting, how you approach staffing. And so if you were speaking to a skeptic who's like, oh, we've seen what happens when chains come into our state and start buying up newspapers, what would you say to say that, hey, we're not that?
Yeah, I think what I would say is we are long-term investors in the quality of the product, and we believe that a quality product and an engaged audience are the drivers of long-term success, both from an impact perspective and from a business perspective. So when it comes to staffing or infrastructure or audience engagement or audience growth, like a quality product and a quality experience is what matters overall. And I think, some of the chains could say that they believe in a quality product, but I think, unfortunately, they make all kinds of short-term driven decisions that undermine the long-term quality of the product and the business.
Yeah, mission and bottom line aren't in opposition. For all of the flaws that people might point to with Amazon, particularly with how it treats its workers, when I read through Jeff Bezos' letters, I'm struck by the extent of his focus on customer experience and on the long term. And I just find it amazing that newsrooms who purport to serve the community will go quickly to taboola ads and things that just degrade the customer experience and chase short-term profits.
Yeah, the short-termism is a real problem. And it's a problem, that also is not a business model problem. It can be exacerbated by your business model, but you can get short-termism in nonprofit news organizations too, just like kind of chasing the next grant. And not necessarily keeping an eye on overall quality and reader experience and service.
So your approach is evolving as you have some of these opportunistic things come up like Maine, but what is your current thinking about, what does wild success look like in 5 years?
Yeah, so wild success, which we are planning for, of course, is 15 states in 5 years. So we have sort of 2 online now. We'll have 1 more, hopefully 2 more by early next year. And then, I think we can just sort of replicate and continue going. In my mind, the most important piece of what we can do right now is continue to identify partners and publishers who will make strong anchors for us in a scaling up strategy. And, the good news is that we hear from those kind of folks every day. So, so my hope is that as we're all kind of riding this wave of growing interest and investment in local news, that we can harness that to really kind of beat the clock on a lot of papers that are also really struggling. Because my other concern is that rural news publishers, in particular independent rural news publishers, are at risk of extinction, either getting bought by political forces or just closing due to the really difficult economics of small places. And so I think we are really in a race against time. So, the 15 states in 5 years isn't just like, oh, I would really love to grow really fast. It's like, I think it's going to take that speed and scale in order to actually solve the problem of local news in small places that I just don't see anybody else tackling.
So now I want to transition into some big picture questions in business theory. One of the things I really looked forward to talking with you about is business theory. As an academic, and me as a sort of a frustrated academic who, MBA and economics major, and if they had had this as a category in my college, most likely to be a professor wearing a tweed jacket with elbow patches, that probably would have been me. I downloaded your dissertation. Didn't get a chance to read all 450-something pages, but I've asked ChatGPT to summarize it, and it's still
Tim, I'll give you
still
a
churning.
prize if you get to the end.
Right.
Slightly horrified, but that's wonderful.
So sort of not quite hardcore theory, but as you look at the industry, there's a lot of conversations about how do the business models need to evolve, what are our revenue sources going to be? How do you see that evolving writ large?
I think we're going through a sort of fracturing and diversification of business models that are based on place and based on, frankly, like the economic inequalities between geographies in this country. So I think the dynamics of what a successful local news business model looks like in, the Los Angeles or New York metro area are just going to be much different than, in places that have populations of much smaller size and scale. And so, in my mind, it's like, a political economy problem, really, because we have something like 3,000 counties in the US, and there is such incredible inequalities between those counties in population and economic size, in demographics. And so it's like a truism, but like there really is no one size fits all. So where I see business models going is that there's going to have to be different solution sets for different scales. What we are trying to do is sort of match a particular scaled federated business model so that it's a solution for smaller places that won't be able to attach themselves to bigger kind of like geographic metro-based models. And, and then I think the other truism for the business models is that it's a sort of all of the above moment. So it's subscriptions and it's advertising and it's events and it's, sponsored content. It's like as many of the things as you can possibly get. And again, I think the success factor for all of those also depends on where you're trying to build that business model. In my mind, one of the super interesting kind of like untold stories / drivers of business model success in local news is that there are just widely different retail concentrations across the US. There are still some communities where, there are still a lot of independently owned kind of mom and pop retail shops that still do a lot of direct advertising. And then there are communities, and we found this in Denton, where all of those independently owned retail chains have been replaced by big box stores. So, if you're like a local sales force, like there really is no door to knock on. And so, because of that difference in the retail base, then I think you also get differences in the potential of an advertising revenue stream for local news.
I mean, it's complicated and it's very intertwined with all sorts of other issues like equity and access, and even even outside of news. I was just listening to Ben Thompson, his Stratechery podcast. He was analyzing what Disney's going through, and they are, it looks like, shifting to more of an advertising model, and that's in competition, which the route they were heading down with a subscription model. And, so they've got the balancing of scale and, trying to understand where their revenue is really going to come from. And local newsrooms are kind of a microcosm of that. And they've got to think through all of those issues. What do you see as the fundamental value that local news provides, in Clayton Christensen's jobs to be done framework? He encourages companies to not think about the product they're producing, but what are they solving? Ben Thompson's also had some good writings on this about what is local news? Are you paying for the article? Are you paying to sort of this general sense of, I know what's going on in my community that I need to know about? And maybe the best thing is for you to tell me nothing you need to worry about today. But what is the value of the fundamental value that we offer.
Yeah, I'll just go back to sort of like what I was talking about before, which is it's really important to understand when you ask that question, what local means and what local means and to who. Because if the local that you're talking about, like for me, for example, if the local that you're talking about is like Boston, I care about what's happening in Boston, but I don't care as much as I care about what's happening in my town. And so, and what's happening in my town is like, yes, what's happening at the school board, or in the town council and around development, but it's also about like, why are there shops closing downtown? What is it with this like crazy development that's happening just down the street? Like, why are there all these traffic signs? Like, when is there the next parade in town? And I think that, that the value of localism and the value of local, like hyper local to people, I think has been totally missed in a lot of these conversations. And so when you say, what is the value of local news? I think that value looks and feels much different, back to our community news discussion, when you're talking about what's happening in my community, like what is this community and what's happening and who am I in relationship to this community, as opposed to like much bigger, kind of more abstract ideas about like I live in this city or I live in this state.
Right. And, we were at a meeting of the Colorado ecosystem that both of us were attending, and someone brought up, sort of the fluffy local stuff as dessert and the hard news as broccoli. And I think you interrupted and said, wait a minute, that's part of the entree. Like, people want to know the restaurants that are opening and closing, the events that are happening, what's going on with the local high school sports team. Like, that is the entree for people. And if I lived in a community that was all hard news, if my government's that corrupt that every day you're supplying me with information about the latest scandal, yeah, maybe that's not a community for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's, I think a lot of these local news conversations that sort of rabbit hole on accountability journalism, and I agree, accountability journalism is really important and it's a cornerstone, but I think it really fundamentally misses why people loved their local paper and why many people still love their local paper, because it's really about the place that they live. It's a portal to the place that they live in all of its various aspects. It's not just about the like, oh, let me make sure that, my taxpayer money is not being misspent, but it's about so much more than that. And so, in our impact framework, we tie all of this to an idea of stronger local communities and social cohesion, and strong local news is driving stronger communities because of the breadth of coverage and because of the breadth of experiences that folks can access about where they live, through the medium, not just of information, but of, events and conversations. And so that I think is the real value. But the challenge, of course, from a business model perspective is that all of that activity has to happen at a much smaller scale than we're used to thinking about and working at.
Yeah. So I mentioned Clayton Christensen earlier, and of course he's most known for his theory of disruptive innovation, and he's pretty pessimistic on the ability of incumbents to innovate. And one of his prescriptions is that incumbents should isolate the innovations in separate parts of the organization, which can be really challenging when you're a small news organization or even a national news organization. And I think to some extent, maybe that happened in the early days of the internet. Knight Ridder had their digital people sort of sequestered. Washington Post had a completely separate digital team. And I don't think that worked out too well. And I think you addressed some of the differences maybe with Clayton Christensen's innovation theories in your dissertation. So what does he miss in local news, or how does it apply?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And actually, I wrote my dissertation, and a big part of that was me sort of wrestling with the Christensen innovation theory. And then I've had the real privilege over the last 3 years of teaching in the CUNY J School executive education program. And they asked me to teach on strategy and innovation and managing change. And so this will be my fourth cohort. And it's been so much fun because my dissertation was a sort of way for me to work out how I think about it. But now I've gotten to teach it and actually talk with students and now run my own organization and think about like, well, how and where does this work and where does it not work? And I think an intuition, which I think was half developed into an insight in my dissertation about sort of where the Christensen approach to innovation falls down in a news and mission-driven context, is that the quality of local service and the mission of local news really does have to be the through line for all of the innovation, right? The core product and the innovation. And what I've heard from my students and witnessed in my dissertation is that those things can get really disconnected when you have like a quote unquote innovation team, and that there's really no way either from a mission perspective or from a strategy perspective to sort of get the innovations back into the core of the organization, or to get the mission and purpose and values from the core organization out into the innovative unit. And so that in a bigger organization, that's really the challenge, is that you have this like not just strategically disconnected, but really mission disconnected satellite. So, I think some of the ways that my students and I talk about solving for that is, first of all, like really clear leadership within innovation projects, and teams really being able to understand when they're in an innovation frame and when they're not, and having clear kind of like KPIs for all of those experiments, so that there can be a way of talking about success and failure, and also not kind of like over investing in something that isn't working. And some of that is just kind of like baseline good in management of innovation practice. But in a news context, I think it's especially important because the industry changes fairly quickly and tends to be very fad driven. And so there has to be some way of not getting stuck in the endless, shiny object chasing hamster wheel, but really making sure that there's progress being made on mission and impact and strategy.
And I think his innovation work is worth reading for leaders. I think just with sort of a little bit of skepticism and some caveats, because you've probably seen this as well, but I've certainly seen firsthand corporate newsrooms kill innovation for some of the exact same reasons that he cites for other industries, that they don't recognize small things that are growing potentially exponentially, but they're still so tiny compared to the reach of a metro daily, and they just don't want to spend resources, or they're afraid of any sort of disruption to how they do business, and so they squash it. And just sort of the inertia of that core business, print being a prime example, can pull you away from all of that. So I think that's all very relevant.
I think that's totally right. And I think the antidote against that, and this is where I think, sort of corporate innovation is at a disadvantage in some ways, because yes, you can have the resources to invest, but there can be such short-termism that you can sort of miss the forest for the trees. I think in a more mission-driven context of local news, and that can be nonprofit or just a sort of general understanding of mission in local news, I think the antidote to that short-termism is to try to understand, well, what's the early evidence of impact here, and is it actually meeting needs that haven't been met before, and do we see the potential of a path for there to be even more needs met by this type of innovation? And so, that's where I think the question of KPIs, and not just kind of like raw audience or growth metrics, but really thinking more about impact, can help navigate some of those, early innovation dilemmas where you can end up overlooking something that is actually quite important and critical to long-term success.
And I think also it depends on the type of innovation, like who's your audience and what are you trying to experiment with or spin up. I think Advance has actually done some interesting things. The subtext product was something that came out of, basically like a skunkworks org that was sequestered, and I think that's doing pretty well. And then on the flip side is Alabama Media Group, which I think is one of the more fascinating evolutions. And they did a little bit of both. I mean, it was all led by the team there, but they spun up different brands, but they completely sort of shook up the organization to get, sort of this new focus. But anyway, that's a deep dive I want to do soon. But, I think you see some good examples of how you can integrate innovation into an existing audience and organizational structure. The last thing I'll leave with on sort of this vein of thinking. It's one of my pet peeves, and I'm wondering if it's something you relate to and have seen. And that is, I'm not seeing this term, but my term for it is false rigor. And that is where you get maybe some poor McKinsey or BCG consultants to come in, or you get a journalist leading some things that maybe they don't quite understand the full picture of the brand and the audience and the second and third order ramifications. So I think that's where we get, real-time journalists who are trying to cover Florida man stories. And the justification is, look, our average CPM is X and they're generating, Y page views. Therefore, they're paying for themselves. When that ignores so many things. One, it ignores the difference between average and marginal revenue. And are you actually monetizing those additional page views? Two, it ignores all those other, second and third order ramifications of where you're actually getting your advertising from. Do they care about these out-of-market viewers that are looking at the Florida man stories? Are they turned off by them? You have subscribers that are turned off? And then all of the people that we've lost over the years that aren't measured in the stats that we do have, like the dog that didn't bark. Are we looking at that? And that sort of rigorous, that intellectual sheen that we put over what I think are poor business decisions because we don't understand that sort of full picture. So that's one of my pet peeves about this industry. And I don't know if you've seen that or can relate.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation is making me grateful that a lot of the community news organizations we work with don't really have any sophisticated digital presence to speak of. So in my day-to-day work, I'm happy to say I don't run into those problems. I understand that they are rife and rampant in other parts of the news media industry and the media industry in general. And, I think it's another argument for why, in the news and information business, like smaller scale on that level makes a lot of sense because you're working in an environment where there's just a much higher trust ratio. And so, it wouldn't make any sense for, the Golden Transcript to run a Florida man story. Like that's not their audience. That's not what they do. But, you can see as you kind of climb up the media scale that those things start to look on the surface, as you said, very compelling when they're actually like deep, logical and business sinkholes.
And I'll just leave this piece before we go into rapid fire with noting that almost all of these metro dailies, all of these chains are doing great work. Like they have some great journalists. They deserve to be supported. And there are metro dailies that are also very healthy. I mean, Salt Lake Tribune, I think, is doing such great work. Seattle Times. I mean, we could name a number of them. So we painted with some broad brushes, but just want to acknowledge that.
Definitely.
So rapid fire questions. So my questions will be short. Your answers don't have to be. And this first one in particular, I would like you to say more than yes or no. But compared to a year ago, are you more or less optimistic about the future of local news?
Okay, I would say I am both, if I can, both more and less optimistic. I would say I'm more optimistic because I think there are other sources of philanthropic and capital support who are taking an interest in news and the sort of like the importance of local news at all scales and the need to get this right from a democracy perspective. I think the issues are clearer than they've ever been. I'm less optimistic though, because I just don't think any of us are moving fast enough to really make a big difference. And I think there are some really intense headwinds, sort of macroeconomic headwinds, but also kind of cultural and social headwinds that are going to make this problem of providing quality local news everywhere like more and more difficult in the years ahead.
Messy desk or clean desk?
Both. So my desk gets very messy and then I deal with it by like somehow finding boxes around my house that then I dump things into in the hopes that someday I will clean them out. So I have a clean, messy desk.
I can relate to that. Best single piece of advice you've been given? Personal, career, life?
Okay, best single piece of advice I've been given. So I'm not sure that this rises to the level of like best advice ever, but one really important piece of advice that I've gotten about scaling a social enterprise like I am doing is that everything scales except the social entrepreneur. And that's been sort of ringing in my head over the summer as we've scaled up and I've bumped up against my needs for like sleep and spending time with my family. So I'm like definitely deep in the throes of trying to figure out how do I scale this thing when I don't scale. And that's a hard problem.
Is there a piece of common advice or conventional wisdom that drives you crazy in its wrongness or oversimplification?
So many, Tim. Okay, but I'll pick on one, slightly controversial, but this is something that's been bothering me that you're giving me the opportunity to mouth off about. So this idea, and I've heard it in Press Forward and elsewhere, that local news will be like the ballet and it will be supported by philanthropy forever, drives me completely bananas. In part because like I think of ballet as like an elite urban institution. And as I'm like going around the country to very small places, I just cannot think of any analogy that is like further from community news than the ballet. And then second of all, I think it just totally overestimates the capacity and interest of philanthropy to actually solve, quote unquote, solve the local news problem. Because, philanthropy is just like incredibly slow and fickle. It's not particularly accountable. There's not particularly enough of it. So I totally agree that we are in a moment where philanthropy can be catalytic, but I really think it's not the solution. And if we think success is kind of remaking local news and philanthropy's like image, I think we're going to be really find ourselves in a dark place. So that piece of conventional wisdom drives me pretty bananas.
Well, we know failure is an important part of the learning process, and despite Silicon Valley's valorization of failure, we still don't like to talk about it. But is there a favorite failure of yours that, helped you learn something really valuable or propelled you to a new place?
So, Tim, I am a failed academic. And that failure will be with me probably for my entire life. I tell the story of starting the trust that like the day that I talked with our board chair, Mark Hand, where he was like, you should go run the trust. And I was like, who, me? And I finally said yes. And I was like, I had to like sob afterwards because it meant letting go of something that I had spent 10 years of my life aiming for and letting go of an identity that was deeply, deeply part of me. So, I will always and forever be both the co-founder of the National Trust and a failed academic. That is like part and parcel of my psychology.
Well, I'm glad you're bringing some of that academic thinking to the field. What is your favorite place to think big?
So I really love to take long hikes. And so when things get, really crazy, my husband and I will go on like 3-hour hikes. And I usually find I can like work out my thinking through walking in the woods. So that's my favorite place.
So this may be a redundant question now, but we know how hard this industry is on people, and doing a startup in any industry is hard on people, and doing a social enterprise is hard on people. So what do you do to sort of maintain your sanity and restore yourself?
I am someone who has always and forever needed 9 hours of sleep. And it's something I really don't particularly like about my biology, but it is what I have been given. So I find that like I have to go to bed at a decent hour. And, now I have teenagers and the teenagers like to stay up. And so basically everybody in my household now knows that like mom is going to go to bed and you're welcome to go and say goodnight to her. She's going to be in bed probably at 10. And like there's no use fighting it. So that's what I have to do to keep my sanity.
Do you have a favorite time-saving hack?
Yes, I am a devoted user of Superhuman, which is a program that sits on top of Gmail and allows you to like partition your inbox and like boomerang emails and schedule send and have snippets. And I really love it. I have to say, it doesn't make me any better at email, but it makes me feel like I'm better at email.
I am also a devoted user of Superhuman, and I thought maybe it was just because I'm an old programmer who loved VI and keyboard shortcuts, but good to know it's not limited to us. If you had to leave this field, would you try to go back to academia, or what would you do if you weren't in journalism?
Well, so I have kind of two answers to that question. So one is that I would definitely go back to academia, and I am grateful to CUNY that I get to keep teaching because I really do love that part of it. But I also I had a hot second as a municipal investment banker, and I really loved the numbers and the like local officials and the deal making. And there's actually like a big part of my job now that is that kind of work. So I would also enjoy that.
Interesting. Do you have a creative measure of success you've set for yourself or your team?
Yeah. So I am always concerned that we are having fun and keeping a sense of humor and particularly enjoying the people and the places that we work with. Like, I love to travel, and I love to travel to random places, and my team, I think, does too. And so we really try to, despite the work that our work is very intense, we really try to like have fun and make sure that we're enjoying ourselves and the process, because it's, as you said, long haul and exhausting work.
All right. And final question. What media recommendations do you have for people? This could be for fun, for work, any format, podcasts, books, TV shows, etc.
So on the books front, I'm reading this summer. We took our family vacation, of course, during the time that we were closing the main deal, to Martha's Vineyard, which is one of my favorite places on the planet. And so while I was there, I started reading Caleb's Crossing, which is a book by Geraldine Brooks, set in the 1600s, and the kind of interface between a Wampanoag tribe and an English settler tribe on Martha's Vineyard. And it's just this like really beautiful novel, and it just renders the beauty, the natural beauty of Martha's Vineyard so well. So that I definitely recommend that book. And then on the TV front, so I'm a huge fan of musicals, and I just loved Schmigadoon. It was like, literally, I just could not stop smiling. I think I'm going to have to rewatch it because it was just like the best of the best of all kinds of genres. And then on the music front, so we are in a Taylor Swift household. I have 6 kids, 4 daughters, and all my daughters are Taylor Swift fans. So I begrudgingly listened to a lot of Taylor Swift, and now I have to say I've gone directly through the Taylor Swift rabbit hole, and I am a rabid fan. And so I listen to a lot of Taylor Swift.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was great.
Thank you, Tim. This was really fun.
Thank you for listening to the Local News Matters podcast. And thanks to Elizabeth for your thoughtfulness and the great work you and your team at the National Trust for Local News are doing for the industry and for local communities. A final thanks to our production partners at Pirate Audio. Pirate Audio believes every community deserves great things to listen to, and they are on a mission to help local newsrooms reach their communities via audio. If you're interested in starting a podcast or need production support for an existing one, let me know and I'd be happy to connect you. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, please follow in your favorite podcast app. Leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. I appreciate the support. You can find past episodes, full transcripts, and relevant links, and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. You can also follow us on most social media channels at lnmpod. If you have recommendations of others doing interesting and innovative work in local news, let me know through the contact form at the website lnmpod.com.